Welcome back to our series on Firebase integration with SwiftUI in iOS app. In today's video, we will be exploring an important feature on Firebase, a remote config. So we will learn how to remotely configure the behavior and appearance of your SwiftUI app without requiring an app update. And now let's get started. But before we do, I'd like to ask your support by liking this video and subscribing to my channel. And your support encourages me to continue creating informative tutorials like this for you. So to begin, using Firebase remote config in our SwiftUI app, we'll refer to this official Firebase documentation. This documentation provides a detailed guidance on integrating remote config and utilizing its powerful features for remotely configuring your app. So if you look down, we're gonna follow those steps and start from there. So let's jump into the code part and see how can we seamlessly integrate Firebase remote config into our SwiftUI app for dynamic configuration changes. So here, I already pre-created two different kind of views. One is called item view 1, another one is item view 2. So basically the item view 1 just going to show the item's name, and item view 2 will show the name and a description from our data. So let's do a quick implementation here. Let's use item 1 so that you can see the difference there. So in order to do that, go to the shopping list view here, or wherever you have this table view here. Then we're going to call item view 1, and we're going to call item and name. Now we're going to run this code. Okay, so we want to enter our credential. Oh yeah, we forgot to remove this error from last time. All right, let's rerun this. Okay, as you can see, the data shows properly, and you can see the text has been bolded. That is because we are using the font headline. So if we switch to item 2, then you should be able to see 2 information on the screen. So let's comment this out and call item 2. I'm gonna pass the name. And we're gonna also pass the description here. So let's run it again. Okay. Test pass or okay. Okay, so it looks like we need to do some alignment to make sure they're aligned there. So that can easily be done from this vStack. Okay, let's run again. All right, now you can see this, we're using the item view 2. So now we want to integrate the Firebase remote config so that we can remotely changing the way we want to show this. So we don't have to redeploy an app to the App Store again in order to change a certain view or a certain aspect of content inside the applications. All right, so let's go back to the documentation and start from there. Okay, so in order to start this, let's follow the step 1, add remote config to your app. So install the Firebase SDK for the Apple platform. When installing Apple SDK, you have the option to adding dependency for analytics. Analytics is required for remote config. Conditional targeting of app instance to user properties and audiences. Okay, I think we might need to do some of the steps. Set it in app default parameters. Get parameter values to use in your app. Okay, so let's start from the beginning here. Let's see if we're having anything here we need to do. Policy elements, next step, get started. We need analytics is required. So then after that, we need to call remote config and remote config setting. Minimum fetch interval set to 0. Okay, let's just copy this one here. And I do believe we have analytics installed. So let's go to the Xcode and take a look. Okay, so here we are. We have the database and also the Firebase manager. I think what we can do is creating a new one here, a new file. Let's call Firebase remote config RC manager. Okay, so class Firebase RC manager. And in our case, we're still gonna use a singleton for this. The reason for that is actually we want to be easily access those remote config data anywhere in the application. So singleton is a good way to go for in this case. So let's start. That shared Firebase RC manager, private init. Do nothing for now. Okay, we might need those, so I think we might need to import maybe analytics. Let's see what kind of information we might need here. Remote config. I think we might be missing something. Let's go to our target, see if there's anything need to be imported. We have analytics without add ID support. Okay, so we do need remote config. Okay, let's import the Swift version of it. Go back to RC manager. Okay. Let's see what we need. Remote config, Firebase, remote config, Swift, yeah. Remote config, maybe it's a part of the import remote config. Okay. So it's part of this remote config, not the Swift one. So let's do that. So basically remote config and remote config will return a remote config. So let's keep tracking those. Private let, private var, remote config, and it's remote config type. So that way we can keep track of them. And then we have a remote config setting. The remote config setting set the minimal to 0. Just remember, this is only for debugging. In the real world application, you do not want to keep fetching this every single time. You might want to fetch. You might want to have some kind of mechanism to fetch once a while to double check to make sure it update, or whenever the user either relaunch the app or bring the app to the foreground, depending on your application's functionality and what kind of requirement you might need it. A lot of time, those settings you only need once a while. You don't need all the time. So just keep that in mind. Remote config, then we give the setting. Okay, so that should help us to initiating the start. Okay, let's see what we need to do next. Set in-app default parameters, the value. You can set in-app default parameter value in the remote config object. You can pass a plist file to it, and it should be able to grab that as a default value. But in our case, we don't really have to. Set a parameter, fetch, and activate the value. So for this, let's copy this code here. And also have an option to listen to for updates in real time. So we're gonna install this fetch for whenever we're beginning to uploading the data, whenever we launch the application, and then after that, we want to have a listener to listen to the changes, so we can updating things. Okay, so I think we're gonna do these two things. So to fetch parameter value from remote config, call this or this method. Any values that you set on the backend are fetched and cached in the remote config object. For cases where you want to fetch the activate values in one call, use fetch and activate with completion. For cases where you want to fetch, okay, this example fetches the value from remote config backend, not cache the values, and the calls activate with completion handler to make them available to the app. I think this is a good example here for us because these updated parameter values affect the behavior and appearance of your app. You should activate the fetched value at the time that ensures a smooth experience for your user, such as the next time that the user opens your app, etc. Okay, so let's go back to implement this first and to test. We're gonna create a function here. I'm gonna call this fetch remote config. We're gonna keep everything simple. So for this one, we're gonna just say display welcome. And when we fetched it, I'll have changes, right? What is this changes? It's Boolean. Okay, so basically when we fetched remote config, I believe the data exists inside the remote config. Last fetch status, respond, activate. Okay, so let's just put a quick print here. If lat error. Print fail to activate remote config data. Otherwise, else if changed is true, successfully fetched and activated the remote config data. Otherwise, print failed to activate remote config data. I think the first one should be instead fail. We're gonna call error error activate activate remote config data error, and then we're gonna attach the error behind it. Okay, so that should be good for now there. And we might want to add a call here, but for now we don't need to do any async. I think this should be fine there. Let's go to the documentation and see what else we need to do. Okay, next one is a listen for updates in real time. So after you fetch parameter values, you can use the real-time remote config to listen for updates from the remote config backend. Real-time remote config signals to connected device when updates are available and automatically fetches the changes after you publish a new remote config version. Real-time updates are supported by Firebase Apple SDK for Apple platform v10 is higher. Okay, so that is good for real-time updates, and in your app, call this add-on configuration listener to start listening for the updates. And important real-time remote config also require Firebase real-time API. Okay, so just keeping that in mind, you will need a real-time API for this. Firebase remote config real-time API, which should already be enabled to you. To verify, open the Cloud Console and select your project and open the API's services page. The API should appear as enabled. If it's missing or not enabled, make sure to click enable the APIs and services. Search for Firebase remote config real-time API and then enable it. So then you will be able to listen to this in real time. So for us, I think we're gonna stick with this this method here, trying to get our data, then update it whenever we launch the applications. So feel free to continue explore this listen for updates in real time. But for the demonstration, I'm gonna just do this instead. Okay, so for the next thing we have to do is actually go enable our Firebase remote config, go to the console, and go to the engage remote config, then you'll be on this page. If you haven't done anything of this, you're gonna see this page like this. So just create this create configuration. Give a parameter name. Just make sure you keep all those things in mind. This is the key you'll pass to the remote config SDK. For example, config.get boolean, then that will be the key. So it's sort of like a JSON. So basically have a key value pair. So just keep that in mind. So we're gonna call this learning. I'm gonna use the lowercase actually. Learning Swift. Data type is a string. Don't need any description here. So I'm gonna have a value. Value, I'm gonna use we can use a JSON dictionary. So let's call this, give a boolean, I would say, is item view 2. Is item view 2, then we're gonna give a boolean value for by default it's a false. So I'm gonna keep that as a false for now. I'm gonna save it. Save the value. We can cancel those and we can publish the change. So we have a thing called learning Swift. So we need to get that key out. And we can get this dictionary of is item view 2 false. Okay, so since we're right here, we're gonna give a default version of that value. So I'm gonna call this var is item view 2. So boolean and default gonna be false. Then we're gonna have function. We want to read read remote config data. So I believe this is a way to access this. So let's see. Let remote let JSON data equal to this remote config volume, and then we want to cast this to a readable volume. JSON volume. So I'll call this remote config volume. And then we're going to call JSON equal to remote config volume dot JSON volume. I'm going to cast that as a string ending. So now we have this JSON. So we can do an if lat check. Then if that succeeds, then we can grab the key, which is the same name we just put up above here for the JSON. So let boolean bool volume equal to JSON as bool. So technically, I believe we need to unwrap this. So let's put it right here. Now we have this bool value. So whenever we have this bool value exist, we want to update that. Okay. And then preferably, I would think want to use this we might want to, so basically at the beginning when we first started, we want to call this and fetch the data. Then whenever we successfully fetched it, we want to call read remote config data. And then when that data successfully got read it, we want to publish that data, right? So let's see if we should make this a observable object. Add publish. I do not believe we need this. I think we still can use the singleton. Okay. So then I think we can call this at the beginning. So we have this application did successfully did launch. So we can fetch right here, I believe. So we're gonna call Firebase RC manager dot shared. Oh, forgot one thing. Static line. Share dot fetch remote config. So that should fetch our data. And whenever we update this, probably want to give it a dispatch. So that makes sure this data is always updated on the main thread. Okay. Yes, we do need it itself. Okay, so I think we should be good there. We should be able to launch this app and get our data updated. And then we can put a print here to see current new remote config data is the self dot is item value item view 2. Okay, so I think we should be good. Let's double check this item view 2's key name on our console. Okay, just double check. So paste in. Okay, it's the same thing. Okay, So I think we should be good. We should be able to see this thing here. And since I already published the remote config, we'll be able to see the data. And we have a default value as a false. So right now, let's put this a shopping list here. Put an if statement here. I'm going to call this a Firebase RC manager shared dot. I'm going to call this is value 2 is true. I'm going to move this over a little bit. Okay, so if that's the true, we want to show item 2 view. Otherwise, I want to show item 1 view. Okay, let's run it. Test at test.com, pass at word. Okay. Okay, we see default version, so that's a false. And we can check right here, see if that prints out. Go to this RC, then we can see if this has been called in the console. Yes, has been called. So now let's check if this new remote config data has been called. And it has been called, but it had little race condition here. So you probably don't see exactly the data right there. So it's a false right now, which just makes sense because we did set to false on the remote config. So let's set that to true and then run this app again. Okay, so in order to make this true again, so just click on this pencil, expand it. I'll make this data to true. Then save again, and remember to always publish your change. Okay, so let's go back to the Xcode. Okay, so let's run this again. Test at test.com, pass at word. All right, now you can see we have this item view 2 version of view as the cell for the table view. So let's check the new remote data, and it is true. So if we want to change this again, but we do not want to relaunch this app every single time, you can always implement the real-time update, the real-time APIs, real-time listening the remote config changes. And there you have it. Implementing remote configuration changes in our SwiftUI app using Firebase remote config. By leveraging this feature, we can remotely control the behavior and appearance of our app without requiring an app update. So as always, if you enjoyed today's video and found it valuable, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. Your support encourages me to continue creating informative tutorials like this for you. Thank you for joining me today's video, and I'll see you in the next one as we explore more exciting features. And until then, keep coding, keep learning, and I'll catch you soon.